The wind howled like a wounded beast, tearing across the frozen tundra with an unforgiving fury. Snow billowed in thick sheets, reducing the world to a swirling void of white. The planet Thessalon was known for its brutal winters, but this storm was unlike anything Dr. Miles Corvin had seen before. He stood at the edge of the research station's landing platform, squinting into the blizzard, his thermal gear doing little to stop the bone-deep chill creeping through his layers. The base's exterior lights flickered in the distance, their glow barely penetrating the storm's wrath. He should have been inside, where it was warm, where he was safe. But something was wrong. The alert had come in barely an hour ago, an unregistered distress signal, weak and erratic, buried beneath the interference of the storm. It shouldn't have been possible. The conditions outside made communication nearly impossible, yet the signal persisted, a faint, pulsing beacon amidst the chaos. No ships were scheduled to land, no convoys were missing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't supposed to be. Corvin, you're not seriously thinking of going out there, are you? Miles turned to see Sergeant Beck, the station's security officer, standing at the entrance of the hangar bay, arms crossed over his thick parka. His expression was one of exasperation, but there was a flicker of concern beneath it. Miles adjusted the straps on his emergency medical pack, already knowing this conversation was coming. If there's someone out there, they won't last the night. Beck exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. This is insane. You're walking into a damn hurricane. Miles didn't argue. He simply pulled his thermal hood over his head, sealing the visor into place. Cover me on comms. If I'm not back in an hour, send a drone. You're a stubborn bastard, you know that? Beck muttered, shaking his head. Miles gave him a lopsided grin before stepping out onto the ice. The cold hit like a sledgehammer. Even through his insulated suit, the sheer force of the wind threatened to knock him off his feet. He steadied himself, activating the HUD display inside his visor. The distress signal flickered faintly on the map overlay, barely 2 kilometers from the base. 2 kilometers in this storm could have been 20. Still, he pressed on, each step crunching through the snow, his breath a steady rhythm against the violent howl of the wind. Minutes stretched into eternity. The only sound was the relentless storm and the occasional static of Beck's voice checking in. Miles barely responded, his focus narrowed to the coordinates ahead. The cold was numbing, seeping into his limbs despite the suit's heating elements. Then he saw it. A shape, half buried in the snow, unmoving. His heart slammed against his ribs as he quickened his pace, nearly stumbling in his desperation to reach it. As he drew closer, details emerged through the storm's fury. A body. Not human. Miles dropped to his knees, brushing away the thick layer of snow covering the figure. It was a woman, tall, slender, with skin the color of twilight, an otherworldly shade of deep blue marred by frost. Her clothing was tattered, barely enough to shield her from the brutal cold. Long dark hair clung to her face, frozen strands brittle as ice. She wasn't breathing. "Come on," Miles muttered, instincts kicking in as he pulled off his gloves and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. A heartbeat. Weak. Faint. But there. Without hesitation, he unclipped his emergency blanket, wrapping it around her frozen form before activating the thermal heater in his suit. He pulled her close, transferring as much warmth as possible, his breath misting in the frigid air. Who was she? How had she ended up here, alone in a storm that could kill even the hardiest of beings? None of it made sense. But questions could wait. Right now, she needed saving. Miles lifted her into his arms, her body unnaturally light, and turned back toward the station, his steps urgent, his mind racing. The storm raged on, but he had no intention of letting it take her. Not tonight. The warmth hit like a wave the moment Miles stepped back into the station. The sudden temperature shift sent a shudder through his body, but he ignored it, pushing forward as Beck rushed toward him. Holy shit! Beck breathed, his eyes widening at the sight of the unconscious woman in Miles's arms. You actually found someone? Miles didn't stop walking. Get the med bay ready. Beck snapped out of his shock, moving ahead to open the doors as Miles carried the woman inside. The sterile glow of the medical wing was a stark contrast to the blizzard raging outside. Miles carefully placed her on the exam table, stripping away the frozen remains of her clothing with careful efficiency. She was still ice-cold, her lips tinged an alarming shade of violet. Miles grabbed the thermal scanner, running a quick assessment. Her core temperature was dangerously low, her vitals barely holding on. "This doesn't make any damn sense," Beck muttered from the doorway. "She should be dead." Miles barely heard him. He was already moving, setting up an IV, administering a warming agent, his hands steady despite the questions pounding in his skull. He had treated hypothermia before, but never on a species he didn't recognize. Who was she? As the machines hummed, working to stabilize her, Miles sat back, exhaling heavily. He could feel the warmth returning to his own limbs now that he was no longer exposed to the cold, but exhaustion was setting in fast. Beck crossed his arms. "You want to tell me why there was an alien woman half buried in the middle of nowhere?" Miles ran a hand through his damp hair, shaking his head. "I don't know, but she wasn't out there by accident." Before Beck could respond, a soft sound filled the room. A breath, a gasp. Miles's head snapped toward the exam table just as the woman's eyes fluttered open. He froze. Her irises were luminous silver, glowing faintly even in the dim light. For a moment, she seemed disoriented, her breathing ragged as she took in her surroundings. Then, with startling speed, she pushed herself upright, wild panic flashing across her face. Hey, easy," Miles said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "You're safe." Her gaze snapped to him, sharp and full of fire, and when she spoke, her voice was laced with exhaustion but unyielding in its strength. "Where am I?" Miles exhaled. "You're at Fort Gale. I found you outside in the storm." She blinked slowly, processing his words. Then her expression shifted, something unreadable flickering through her luminous eyes. Her fingers curled into the blankets wrapped around her, as if grounding herself. "They left me," she murmured. Miles frowned. "Who?" She swallowed, her throat working against the effort to speak. "My people." Her silver eyes locked onto his. "They left me to die." The words hung in the sterile air of the medical bay. Miles felt the weight of them settle in his chest, a slow, cold realization creeping over him. "They left me to die." The woman, alien, regal even in her disheveled state, sat rigidly on the examination table, her silver eyes dull with exhaustion but sharp with something deeper. Not just anger. Not just shock. Betrayal. Miles had seen that look before. Soldiers abandoned on the battlefield. Refugees left behind by governments that no longer had use for them. It was the look of someone who had given everything to their people, only to be discarded like a broken tool. He knew better than to ask too many questions at once. She had just woken from near death. Her body was still recovering from the brutal cold. But he needed to understand. "You were abandoned," he said carefully, keeping his voice level. "Why?" Her fingers tensed around the blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked away, her jaw tightening as if she wasn't sure whether she wanted to answer. Miles waited. He had spent enough years treating patients to know that silence was sometimes the best tool. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "My name is Lyrian Valkesi," she said, each syllable carrying the weight of something once powerful. "Princess of Kravath, or was, princess." Miles tried not to let his expression shift, but his mind was already racing. Kravath. He had heard the name before. One of the outer system monarchies, known for their rigid hierarchy and brutal politics. It was a world where royalty was more than blood. It was currency, power, and control. And yet, here she was, alone. Why would they exile their own princess? Miles asked, watching her carefully. Lyrian let out a bitter breath. "Because I refused to be a pawn." Her words carried more pain than she likely intended to show. She exhaled sharply, her fingers twitching like they wanted to tear at something. Her past, her fate, the invisible chains still wrapped around her. Miles leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Sounds like a long story." She shot him a look, tired but still full of fire. "It is. I've got time." Lyrian studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether she could trust him. Then she let out a slow breath, shoulders slumping slightly. "The Kravath throne isn't just inherited," she said. "It's maintained, through alliances, through war, through marriage." Miles exhaled quietly. "An arranged one?" She nodded. "One that would have condemned my people. My father, the king, sought an alliance with the Varak Dominion, a warmongering empire that would have swallowed Kravath whole the moment I was bound to them. I refused, publicly, loudly." Miles could picture it, the defiance, the moment a ruler's child stood against everything that had been laid out for them. He had seen it before, in different ways, in different wars. But this was something even worse. "What did they do to you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Lyrian's throat worked as she swallowed. "They couldn't execute me without risking public unrest, so they chose the next best thing. They declared me a traitor and exiled me under the guise of honor. They left me here, on a frozen wasteland, with nothing but the clothes on my back, a slow death that wouldn't stain their hands." Miles's hands clenched at his sides. He had expected politics, expected betrayal in some form. But this was calculated, and it infuriated him more than it should have. Before he could respond, Lyrian lifted her chin, a ghost of a smirk playing at the edges of her lips despite her exhaustion. "And then a human of all things found me instead. Imagine my father's rage if he knew." Miles snorted. "Sounds like I just made the royal hit list." She actually laughed, a short, sharp sound, but real. And for the first time he saw something beyond the defiance, relief. Maybe, for the first time, she wasn't completely alone. Lyrian was stronger than she looked. Within hours, her color had returned, the frostbite fading from her fingers as the warmth of the station revived her body. Despite Beck's endless warnings that she could be a threat, she hadn't shown any sign of hostility. If anything, she seemed more concerned with regaining her own sense of control. Miles respected that. She had been left for dead, stripped of her title, her home, her future. Yet she refused to be weak. As she moved around the medical bay, stretching out stiff limbs, she eyed Miles carefully. "You haven't asked what you're going to do with me yet." Miles exhaled through his nose. "Haven't decided." She raised an eyebrow. "I am technically a fugitive. Harboring me could get you killed." He gave her a dry look. "I don't think you realize how boring this place is. You're the most interesting thing to happen in months." Lyrian smirked, but it didn't reach her eyes. "So, I'm entertainment?" "No," he said, voice quieter now. "You're alive. That matters." Something flickered in her expression, but she looked away before he could read it. Miles glanced at the monitors, double-checking her vitals. "You're stable, stronger than most humans would be after what you went through." She scoffed. "We Kravath don't break easily." He could see that, but that didn't mean she hadn't been damaged. Lyrian ran a hand through her dark hair, letting out a slow breath. "What do I do now?" Miles hesitated. "That depends. If you try to leave on your own, you'll be caught. If you go back, they'll kill you. And if you stay here too long..." He exhaled. "Well, let's just say I don't have a good track record of keeping secrets from authority." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "So my choices are exile, death, or trusting a human medic with a questionable sense of self-preservation." Miles grinned. "Pretty much." Lyrian huffed, shaking her head. "Wonderful." But then she did something unexpected. She extended her hand toward him. Not as a demand, not as a plea, as a choice, a tentative, fragile trust. Miles looked at her outstretched hand, then back at her face. He saw the storm behind her silver eyes, the weight of everything she had lost. He clasped her hand in his. The warmth between them was real, solid, a promise, unspoken but understood. "All right, princess," he said with a lopsided grin. "Let's figure this out together." Lyrian squeezed his hand briefly before letting go, her smirk returning. "First rule," she said, "don't call me princess." Miles chuckled. Something told him this was just the beginning. The days passed in uneasy silence. Lyrian was recovering faster than expected, her Kravath physiology proving far more resilient than a human's would have been after such brutal exposure. She had regained her strength enough to walk the corridors of Fort Gale with measured, careful steps. But even as her body healed, Miles knew that her mind was still caught in the storm that had nearly claimed her life. She was trapped, not by the snow, not by the exile forced upon her, but by the knowledge that her people had abandoned her. Miles found her standing by one of the reinforced windows near the mess hall, staring out at the icy wasteland beyond. The storm had finally settled, revealing Thessalon's endless frozen plains stretching toward the horizon. "You keep looking out there like you're expecting something," he said, stepping beside her. Lyrian didn't turn. Her silver eyes remained fixed on the snow. "I suppose I am." Miles leaned against the frame, watching her. "Expecting rescue?" She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "If my father wanted me back, he wouldn't have left me to freeze to death." That much was true. He had read up on the Kravath monarchy after she had told him her name. cold, efficient rulers, known for eliminating weaknesses with precision. A rebellious heir refusing an alliance? That wasn't something they could afford to tolerate. Still, there was something in her voice, an edge of uncertainty. "You don't sound convinced," he noted. Lyrian exhaled slowly. "My father is ruthless, but he is also proud. He wouldn't want the galaxy to know that his own daughter was left to die on an uninhabited wasteland." She paused. "And the Varak Dominion? They don't take betrayal lightly. If I was supposed to be their leverage over Kravath, they won't simply let me disappear." Miles straightened. "You think someone might come looking for you?" She turned to face him at last, crossing her arms. "Either to take me back," she said, her voice quieter now, "or to make sure I never return." A slow tension crept up his spine. He had been so focused on getting her stable, on keeping her alive, that he hadn't considered what came next. Fort Gale was supposed to be an isolated research outpost, far from the politics of the galaxy. It wasn't meant to harbor fugitives, let alone exiled royalty with enemies who had the power to make an entire planet disappear if they wanted to. And yet, here they were. Miles sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You really know how to make things complicated, Princess," she smirked faintly. "I told you not to call me that." "Right, Lyrian." He looked at her again, more serious this time. "What do you want to do?" Her smirk faded. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "I don't know," she admitted. It was the most honest thing she had said since he found her. Miles nodded. "Then we figure it out, but we do it fast." She watched him for a long moment, as if measuring the weight of his words. Then finally she nodded back. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later. Miles had been working in the med bay, reorganizing supplies, when the security alarms blared through the station. The automated voice of the base's AI cut through the silence. "Unauthorized vessel detected. Approach trajectory locked onto Fort Gale." His blood ran cold. Miles grabbed his comm unit and flicked it on. "Beck, tell me you've got eyes on that ship." Beck's voice came back sharp and tense. "It's not one of ours. No ID code, no official markings." A pause. "And it's armed." Miles cursed under his breath. He didn't need to ask who it was. He already knew. Lyrian appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully composed, but he could see the tightness in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled subtly at her sides. "They found me," she said, her voice unreadable. Miles grabbed his jacket and secured his holster. "We don't know that yet." Lyrian scoffed, a humorless sound. "We do." He couldn't argue with her. The timing was too perfect. She had barely been here long enough for anyone outside the base to suspect her presence. The only ones with a reason to come looking were those who had left her in the first place, or those who had been promised her as part of a deal. Either way, this wasn't a coincidence. By the time they reached the main control room, Beck was already at the console, his eyes locked onto the surveillance feed. The ship was a sleek, black craft cutting through the snowstorm with the precision of a predator. Miles didn't need to see the insignia to know exactly what kind of people were inside. Mercenaries, not military, not a Kravath royal envoy. These were hired blades, likely sent to finish the job her father had started. "They're hailing us," Beck muttered. Miles clenched his jaw. "Patch it through." The holoscreen flickered, and a face appeared, masked, unreadable, but the voice was unmistakably cold. "Fort Gale, you are harboring a fugitive," the stranger said. "Hand her over, and no one else has to die." Lyrian inhaled sharply beside him, but when Miles glanced at her, her expression remained unreadable. She was good at that. Too good. Miles turned back to the screen, crossing his arms. "I don't know what you're talking about." The masked figure tilted their head slightly. "Don't insult my intelligence, Doctor. We know she's there." Miles didn't flinch. "And what if she is?" A short pause, then the voice turned sharper, edged with quiet malice. "Then you have a choice, Doctor." Miles already knew what that choice was. Hand her over or die with her. He exhaled slowly, looking at Lyrian again. She met his gaze, silver eyes steady, unwavering. This was her fight. She had known it would come eventually, but he had a choice too. Miles turned back to the screen. "I'm not in the habit of handing over people to killers." The masked figure didn't react at first. Then, slowly, they leaned forward. "Then you'll die for her." The transmission cut out. Outside, the ship's engines roared louder, and the base's defenses kicked into high alert. Miles pulled his gun from its holster and exhaled. He wasn't a soldier, never had been, but he had saved Lyrian once before. And he wasn't about to let her die now. The moment the transmission cut, the tension in the control room thickened. The steady hum of the station's defensive systems came online, casting a red glow across the consoles. Outside, the mercenary ship circled like a wolf stalking wounded prey, its hull gleaming against the icy wasteland. Miles could feel the weight of Lyrian's gaze on him. He knew what she was thinking. This was her fight, her mistake. He didn't have to be involved. But she didn't understand. He had already chosen his side. Beck slammed a fist against the console. "We're in deep shit." His voice was edged with frustration, but beneath it, Miles could hear something else, fear. "We're not equipped to fight off a damn assault force." Lyrian stepped forward, her posture tight, controlled. "We can't stay here. The station's defenses will slow them down, but they'll breach eventually." Miles rubbed a hand down his face. She was right. The base had perimeter turrets, but against a mercenary gunship, they might as well be throwing rocks. "What are our options?" Beck asked. Miles exhaled. "There's a supply tunnel beneath the station. Leads out 1/2 kilometer to an old satellite post." Beck narrowed his eyes. "And you didn't mention this before, why?" "Because it was half buried in the last storm," Miles admitted. "But it's our best shot." Lyrian was already moving. "Then we go." Beck hesitated. He was a soldier, but this wasn't his fight. He had signed up to guard a research outpost, not battle mercenaries hunting an exiled princess. He looked at Miles. "You're really doing this?" Miles met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm not handing her over." Beck swore under his breath but nodded. "Then we better move fast." Alarms blared. Miles didn't need to check the monitors to know the mercenaries had landed. They were out of time. The tunnel was dark, filled with frozen debris and the echo of their hurried footsteps. The station above them trembled, distant explosions rattling through the structure. "They're blowing through the outer defenses," Beck muttered, gripping his rifle. "They'll be inside in minutes." Lyrian pressed forward, her breath steady despite the tension in her frame. She had been hunted before. She knew what came next. Miles moved beside her, his pulse thrumming in his ears. He wasn't a fighter. He was a medic. His job had always been to fix things, not destroy them. But he had no illusions about what would happen if the mercenaries caught them. "They won't stop," Lyrian said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "Even if you surrender, they'll kill you for interfering." Miles glanced at her. "I know." She inhaled deeply, her silver eyes searching his. "Then why are you still here?" Because he couldn't leave her. Because something in him refused to let her die, alone and hunted, on a planet that had already tried to kill her once. But he didn't say any of that. Instead, he reached for her hand just briefly, just long enough for her to feel the warmth of his touch before he pulled away. "We're not done yet," he said. Lyrian's breath caught, but she nodded. The tunnel sloped upward toward the satellite outpost. Light from the storm seeped in through the cracks in the structure, casting jagged shadows. Beck reached the exit first, shoving aside a frozen panel. "We're clear." Gunfire erupted. Beck barely had time to duck before a plasma shot struck the wall inches from his head. Lyrian moved on instinct, shoving Miles to the ground as more blasts cut through the air. Snow and ice exploded around them. The mercenaries were already here. Miles looked up, his heart hammering. 3 figures emerged from the white haze, their armor gleaming with the emblem of the Varric Dominion. They had come to finish what Kravath had started. And they weren't leaving without Lyrian. The cold bit into Miles's skin as he hit the ground, the snow absorbing the shock of his fall. His mind screamed at him to move, but everything seemed to slow, time stretching unbearably long as plasma bolts sizzled through the frozen air. Lyrian was already reacting. Before the next shot could land, she lunged, rolling behind the broken remains of an old comms array. Beck was right beside her, cursing under his breath as he fired a quick return shot, forcing the mercenaries to scatter. Miles barely had time to register what was happening before Lyrian was yanking him up by the collar. "Move," she hissed, shoving him toward better cover. A bolt struck the ice where he had just been. If she had waited another second, no time to think, no time to hesitate. The mercenaries advanced, their silhouettes barely visible through the whirling snow. They moved like professionals, flanking wide, cutting off escape routes. They weren't here to negotiate. They had orders, to capture or kill. Miles clenched his jaw, gripping the sidearm Beck had shoved into his hands before they had left the station. He was no soldier, but he wasn't about to roll over and die either. Lyrian turned to him, her breath coming in short bursts. "They're trying to corner us," she murmured. "If they pin us down here, we're done." Miles nodded, his mind racing. "Then we need to disrupt their plan." Beck fired another shot before ducking back down. "That's a real nice way of saying we're screwed." Lyrian ignored him, her gaze sweeping the battlefield. "We go up." Miles followed her line of sight to the wreckage of an old signal tower, half buried in ice but still standing. It was a long shot, but if they could get higher ground, he met her gaze. "You sure about this?" Lyrian exhaled. "No, but it's better than dying down here." That was good enough for him. They moved fast. Beck laid down covering fire, forcing the mercenaries to take defensive positions as Miles and Lyrian sprinted toward the tower. The snow was thick, dragging at their steps, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Plasma bolts tore through the air, searing the metal as they climbed. The structure groaned under their weight, unstable from years of neglect, but they didn't stop. By the time they reached the top, the battlefield had shifted. The mercenaries hesitated. They hadn't expected a change in elevation, hadn't accounted for the fact that their prey might actually fight back. Lyrian took advantage of that hesitation. She moved with the precision of someone who had trained for war her entire life. Even without a weapon of her own, she used the environment, kicking loose metal debris, sending chunks of frozen wreckage tumbling down toward their attackers. Miles, breathless and gripping his blaster, fired when he had a clean shot. He wasn't a soldier, but he was a damn good shot when it counted. One mercenary dropped, their armor sparking as they collapsed into the snow. The remaining two hesitated, realizing this wasn't going to be as easy as they had expected. And that's when Beck took his shot. A direct hit to the ship's engine. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was enough. The mercenaries turned in shock as their only way off the planet became a plume of fire and wreckage. Their mission had failed, and they knew it. Without another word, they fell back, disappearing into the storm, their retreat as silent as their arrival. Miles watched them go, his pulse still racing. He half expected another attack, another fight, but none came. They had won. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. The fire from the wreckage cast long shadows across the snow, flickering against the ice like dying embers. The wind howled, but it no longer carried the promise of death. Miles sat on the remains of a fallen support beam, catching his breath. His hands were still shaking, his body still wired from the battle. But he was alive. And so was Lyrian. She stood at the edge of the wreckage, staring at the ruins of the mercenary ship, her expression unreadable. Snowflakes caught in her dark hair, silver eyes reflecting the light like twin moons. Beck walked up beside them, rubbing a hand over his face. "Well, that was the most fun I've had in years," he muttered. "So what the hell do we do now?" Miles looked at Lyrian. This was her moment, her choice. She had spent her entire life being told where to go, what to do. She had been abandoned, hunted, and left for dead. But she was still here, and this time she wasn't going to let anyone decide her fate for her. Lyrian exhaled, the cold turning her breath into mist. "I can't stay on Thessalon," she admitted. "If my father sent mercenaries, he'll send more, and the Dominion won't stop until they're sure I'm no longer a problem." Beck frowned. "So we run?" "No," Lyrian said firmly. "We leave." Miles raised an eyebrow. "There's a difference?" She turned to him, the fire in her gaze burning brighter than it ever had. "Yes," she said, "because I'm not running away." Miles felt something stir in his chest. Hope. Lyrian's fight wasn't over, but for the first time she had a choice, and she had chosen to live. Beck sighed. "All right. Guess that means we need a ship." Lyrian smirked. "Know where we can steal one?" Miles chuckled, shaking his head. "You really are trouble." She held out her hand. "Then stop following me." He stared at her hand, the same hand he had pulled from the snow only days ago. She wasn't the same woman anymore. Neither was he. Miles took her hand. Lyrian squeezed it briefly, then turned toward the horizon. They weren't exiles anymore. They were free. And together, they would decide what came next.